Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming by for another episode of the Ben Werman podcast. Today, I have with me Vijay Boyapati. He is, in my opinion, one of the absolute best in the game at explaining Bitcoin in very simple terms. And I realized, I was just telling Vijay before we started recording that I did what every Bitcoiner does. I started a podcast, guns blazing, got like 15 episodes out, and realized, oh wait, I've gone totally off the rails on every single episode. We just get so deep into the libertarian changing the world rabbit hole, and we aren't. I still haven't had like a bona fide Bitcoin 101 episode. So super happy to have VJ here. Thank you for joining me, sir.
I'm really glad to be on your show, Ben.
Why don't we start with a bit of your background? Where did you come from? How did you get into this Bitcoin world?
So you can probably tell by my accent that I wasn't born in the US. I'm actually Australian by birth. I came to the US when I was in my early 20s to do a PhD in computer science. Didn't end up starting the PhD and ended up at a small startup at the time called Google. It was a much, much smaller company. So my background is in computer science and specifically in machine learning.
Excellent. And how did you end up finding Bitcoin? When did that interject into your life?
So I'll start a little bit before when I found out about Bitcoin. I left Google in 2007 to go campaign for Ron Paul. I was just blown away when I first came across Ron Paul, who's the only political candidate I'd ever seen talking about the importance of sound money and its impact on the economy and on civilization and just the destruction that's wrought by inflation that most people don't understand. So I went and campaigned for him, and unfortunately, it didn't work out, and it actually dejected me a little bit about the political process because I got to see it up front, very very close up, and did a lot of grassroots campaigning, and what I realized that there's some very powerful interest groups who control the political process. And so, for instance, Ron Paul was excluded from the Republican debate in one of the early primaries in New Hampshire. And so I realized that if you want to change the world, that doing it through the political process isn't actually that effective, unfortunately. And so I was dejected about that for a few years. But then in 2011, I had a bet. I've been interested in economics for a long time. I had a bet with a friend of mine about the Federal Reserve policy and whether or not they would increase interest rates. And the bet was for a single silver eagle, which was worth $50 at the time. And I won the bet. And my friend, who's one of the best investors I know, said, I can give you the silver coin, but there's this new form of money that I think you should take instead. How about I give you some Bitcoins? And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, let me show you. Just download this software on your laptop. And I went ahead and did that. And my laptop started getting really hot, almost melting, because it was like verifying transactions on the blockchain. Um, and eventually it downloaded, and he said, okay, let me show you how to create an address. And we created an address, and he sent me 5 Bitcoins. I think the price was about $10 at the time. And he said, look, I sent you 5 Bitcoins. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't understand the block explorer. It was just like a bunch of random strings of numbers and letters, and didn't make any sense to me. But that's what really got me going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And I think because of my interest in Austrian economics, I was particularly curious about how this new form of money, which it became clear to me pretty quickly that this was a new form of money. How does it have any value at all? And I think personally, I think this is probably the most important question in economics, at least of the last century, and doesn't receive anywhere near as much attention as it deserves.
Yeah, I mean, I'd completely agree with you, and I think it's hilarious how your first impression was, I don't really know what this is, but it makes my laptop really hot because I heard the exact same thing. I talked to Derek Ross recently to do like an episode about Noster, and that was pretty much his exact same reaction. It was like, huh, this is like interesting, but my room is like really hot, and it just seems to be using a lot of energy, and it's expensive. So he kind of just tossed it out after that. So for a lot of people, just something that simple and like the fact that it just uses energy is a turnoff. And I think that might be just a perfect transition for the first question here, because I know that so many people hear that and they get hung up on it. This idea that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, it's bad for the environment, it's boiling the oceans. What would your answer to that be? Someone who says, like, this sounds interesting, and I do see some value in giving people this money that anyone can use. It's interesting, but I don't want to be a part of it because it's, using too much energy is bad for the environment.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting about Bitcoin mining is it's like a truly free market. It's incredibly competitive, and miners make very, very razor thin profit margins. And one of the most important cost, I should say, the most important input cost to miners is the cost of electricity. So what miners are really looking for more than anything else is a cheap source of electricity, and in particular, they're looking for electricity um, it was otherwise going to be wasted. And there are a lot of locations around the world where energy grids produce excess energy that isn't consumed by a local population. And there are certain provinces in China, for instance, where they have massive overcapacity of electricity. And Bitcoin miners tend to gravitate to those kind of power sources around the world. Uh, they are particularly good. Bitcoin miners are particularly good at balancing energy grids. That is consuming excess energy when it's not being used and being able to turn off when the electricity is needed for actual, like, turning lights on and that sort of thing. So I think Bitcoin mining is deeply misunderstood. I think it is actually one of the things which will be seen as uh, most beneficial for renewable resources, because what it does is it gives an incentive for renewable resources, renewable energy sources to be developed, because typically it's hard to develop a renewable energy source unless you already have a sort of economy already around that, and there's an incentive to provide energy to it. With Bitcoin mining, you can go to places around the world where there might not be a big population, but there's a very cheap energy source, and you can start to develop infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and then make that area sort of habitable and make it, an exciting place to to live for people, because you have the build out of infrastructure, you have an energy grid being developed, you have the renewable source being developed because there's a financial incentive to do so. And so that's like things like geothermal in Iceland, or volcano energy in El Salvador, or just hydroelectric in places around America. So I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment. I think it provides the ultimate incentive to develop renewable resources.
Gotcha. I love that. And I completely agree. And I think that the super summarized version of that for listeners would be that Bitcoin miners, more than anyone else, want the cheapest, most efficient energy possible, and they're going to seek that out. So as we get better, more efficient energy, then those miners will act as sort of a sponge that absorbs that demand wherever it is, and really give more capital and opportunity to those like up and coming like new forms of energy. And it doesn't matter like which type of energy you're really into, because I know that everyone has their sort of thing that they think is the best. Like some people will always say like, oh, we have to stick with oil and coal, those are the cornerstone. Other people are like, I want solar and wind. The cool thing about Bitcoin miners is they don't care about your ideology or what political side you're on, or which one of these things that you think has the brightest future is automatically going to go to funding the best, most efficient types we have. So if I were to come up with, you know, in innovation is such a big part of energy. Like we don't think that there's any innovation to be had there, but I believe there personally is. If I were to invent a new form of ultra efficient energy, and I had a Bitcoin miner, I would be making a bunch of Bitcoin. So that's an easy incentive to just go straight to where the best energy is. And
Can I give one more
of
concrete
course,
example of this, Ben? There are a lot of places where we extract oil from the ground, and one of the byproducts of the oil extraction process is the creation of natural gas. And in a lot of these places, they don't have the infrastructure to transport that natural gas. And what do? They just burn it. This is why you see these flames, they're flaring natural gas. And actually, it's really quite inefficient to flare natural gas in this way. The amount that's actually burned off is a fairly small percentage. And in places like this, Bitcoin miners thrive. There's actually companies that go out to these remote locations and just start mining, because you don't need a connection. You don't need a natural gas connection. You just go to where the natural gas is being flared off. All you need is an internet connection. So they have an internet connection in these remote locations, and they capture the gas that would otherwise be flared at a much, much higher rate. And this is literally saving emissions, very, very harmful emissions, methane emissions, which are far more harmful than carbon dioxide. It's being captured by these Bitcoin miners. This is I would say, a very direct example where Bitcoin is saving the environment. And if you were to turn, Bitcoin off, it would be really quite harmful on net to the environment to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, and I'll definitely leave some links in the show notes for people to continue learning that, because that was one of my actual personal obstacles when I just started this journey in 2017, and I was all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking I was the smartest person ever for getting some XRP because their website says it's good for the environment, it uses so much less energy. We've all been there. Maybe pretty much everyone has been there, just coming in as an idiot, getting tripped up on these little things. But I'm telling people to keep researching. I promise you, it's deeper than that. So I just put myself a little list here on the side of my screen so we can just start checking these off. The next one that I hear a lot on Twitter still to this day is people talking about how Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. Like, where's the intrinsic value? What does intrinsic value mean, and why are people getting this wrong on Bitcoin?
I think it's really hard for most people to wrap their minds around why money has value. Like, most people understand traditional assets, they're more intuitive because you value them based on their cash flow. Whether it's stocks or bonds or real estate, they produce cash flow. So stocks have dividends, bonds have interest, and real estate has rental income that you get. And so you can value, say, a rental property based on how much rent it produces. And you can say, well, it produces $5,000 a month. We'll say that the value of the house is 10x or 20x the rental income per year, and then you get a valuation. Money by itself doesn't produce interest. Base money does not produce interest. And gold was money for most of human history. Gold doesn't produce any dividends. It's just like a shiny rock. So money is valued in a very different way, and we value money based on the functions it provides to society, which are absolutely crucial for us to have a division of labor. Before money, what you had is very simple societies which conducted barter between people, and trade was very limited in geographical scope. So what are the functions of money? The typical one people think about today is the medium of exchange role of money, which is you go to the shop and you buy some bread and you pay and you use it in exchange. But really, actually, probably the most important function of money is as a store of value, that it's something that you keep your savings in, and you keep those savings through time because you want to have something that's valuable in the future so you can potentially purchase or exchange later on in the future. And the other function of money is as a unit of account, which is that goods are priced in terms of money, and you calculate your profits and your losses in a modern economy in terms of the unit of account. So those are the three big functions of money: store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. And how does money get value? It gets its value based on how many people have adopted it for those functions of money. So the price level of money is basically just a direct mapping of how many people have adopted it as money. And the reason that something like Bitcoin has value is that people look at it and say, wow, this is actually better money. And why is it better money? It's because there are certain attributes that make for a good money, and these have been known for thousands of years. They've been known since the time of Aristotle. A good money should be portable. It should be verifiable, easy to verify that it's really what you think it is. it should be divisible. You should be able to break it into smaller pieces. So, for instance, gold is better money than a cow because it's hard to divide a cow into small pieces. Um, and probably the most important attribute of a good money is scarcity. You wouldn't want to put your savings into sand, for instance, because sand is super abundant. You can go to the beach and just get a bucket and you got like a lot of money. That doesn't work. People wouldn't trust their savings in that. And this is really why gold was chosen as money, and outcompeted all of its rivals in history. It's really hard to produce gold. And the thing that really makes it so that Bitcoin has begun to outcompete other forms of money is if you look at these attributes that make for a good form of money and a good store of value, Bitcoin excels at all of them. It is superior to fiat money, dollars, pounds, yen, and euro, but it's also superior to its ancient and venerable cousin gold because you can do something with Bitcoin you can't do with gold. I can send Bitcoin to someone on the other side of the world as easily as I can send an email. And I like to describe Bitcoin as gold with teleportation built in. It's like gold with this superpower. So it's, supercharged gold. It's a new form of gold that is like 10x better than gold. That's why at the margin people have begun adopting Bitcoin, and that's starting to accelerate, I think, because this knowledge is spreading more widely and more quickly as more and more influential people recognize this, and then they start spreading the word and saying, hey, wow, this is really good money. I want to keep my savings in it. Why aren't you guys keeping your savings in it? So it is hard to understand because it's not like a cash generating asset. But if you look at it through the lens of what makes for good money, Bitcoin is the best money that's ever existed.
I love it. And something I realized while you were just explaining that there is that I think I forgot to mention at the very beginning of this episode that the article that you wrote that was my absolute favorite was the Bullish Case for Bitcoin. And I think anyone out there who's been around for a while knows that this article is a must read. And I just pulled a little piece out of it that is perfect for what you just said. I had this saved. You said there's an obsession in modern monetary economics with the medium of exchange role of money. In the 20th century, states have monopolized the issuance of money and continually undermined its use as a store of value, creating a false belief that money is primarily defined as a medium of exchange. Many have criticized Bitcoin as being an unsuitable money because its price has been too volatile to be suitable as a medium of exchange. This puts the cart before the horse, however. Money has always evolved in stages, with the store of value role preceding the medium of exchange role. And I think that's some extra additional color for people to think of when they're looking at how monetization works over a long period of time, because that's an extremely common one. People tell me like I can't use Bitcoin at the store, and they don't want to use it because it moves around too much, and we're looking at only that medium of exchange piece of it. In that case, people have completely forgot that money should be a good form of savings first. This has been, as we've been part of this giant fiat experiment, I feel like the idea of savings has been just like beaten out of our heads. It's supposed to be a bad thing now because it needs to be bad in order for them to tell you that inflation is good. So a little bit to chew on there for folks. But I mean, what do you think about all that? Like, do you see that this truly is the reason why there's so much confusion there, and Bitcoin is the solution to this savings that we haven't had since gold?
Yeah, I think if you go back only a few generations, maybe 5 or 6 generations, people used to think of money as something that you saved in. You kept your savings in money because it kept its value over time because money was gold. Um, that's a good quote because the government in the 20th century certainly has undermined people's belief that money can be used as savings. But what I think and what I tried to emphasize in the book that I wrote was that all market-based monies go through an evolution before they get to the final stage of money, fully fledged money, which is a unit of account. All market-based monies start out as collectibles. They're just valued for their own sake, just as a curiosity. So gold was a shiny rock and happened to be, good for jewelry, and people used it because they thought it had religious significance. And so that's where it got its first value.
And
Over
before
time,
that, it was the seashells. Like it always starts as this thing that people just pick up and say, like, "Oh, this thing's interesting." Like that's the very first step.
absolutely, that's how a market price is established. Is just out curiosity. It's a whimsy of the possessor. And over time, as more and more people adopt it, as a curiosity, it starts to become a store of value because the people who are starting to adopt it and like it and think it's a curiosity recognize that other people value it as well. And so they say, well, maybe I can keep some of my savings in this thing. As it becomes widely adopted as a store of value, then its purchasing power will start to plateau and become more stable because the purchasing power is really a function of how many people have adopted it as a form of savings. And once that sort of slows down and you've gotten everyone in society who are saving this thing and its purchasing power sort of flattens off, then it's really suitable as a medium of exchange because you don't really want to use something as a medium of exchange when its purchasing power is volatile, especially volatile to the upside. And there's this classic story in Bitcoin lore of the person who bought two pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoins. And we all can understand that that person would much rather have those 10,000 Bitcoins now, which are worth, goodness, $700 million, as opposed to having eaten those two pizzas 10 years ago. So you don't want to use something as a medium of exchange when it's potentially going to become money because that value is going to go up. So that there's an opportunity cost of using it. But eventually, everyone I believe on Earth is going to own some Bitcoin, and that's when its purchasing power is going to be much, much more stable. That's when people will start thinking about it as a medium of exchange, and when merchants will have a big incentive to accept it in exchange. Because right now, most merchants don't come across many customers who have savings in Bitcoin. And so there's not a big incentive for them to build out the infrastructure in their restaurant or their store to accept Bitcoin. But that's going to change. That's going to change, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years. And then finally, when it's widely used as a medium of exchange, that's when you start seeing money being used as a unit of account. That's when you'll go to the grocery store and a loaf of bread will be like 2,000 Satoshis or something like that. And then Bitcoin will have reached the final stage in the evolution of money. It'll be a unit of account, and I believe it'll be the global unit of account.
Right. And a couple interesting points that you had there. One, just about how the the major medium of exchange phase begins once things have stabilized a bit and all of us crazy people with laser eyes on the internet stop holding on to it for dear life. Because right now, you'd better have a dang good service for me in order for me to part with my Bitcoin. And that's a good thing. That's because we're in that early phase where, you know, you're an old ancient person and you see the shiny rock on the ground and you're hoarding it and you're thinking, and seeing your community start to hoard it too, and you're thinking, okay, like maybe if I just hold on to this rather than just instantly spending it everywhere, it might pay off in the long run. Because if more and more people start accumulating this stuff, it becomes something we can trade, and more people want it. You can kind of see how that long-term vision comes into play, and this is exactly the same thing as that's going on with Bitcoin. So I just find it so silly when people talk about, oh, like, if you're not spending your Bitcoin, you're not a real Bitcoiner, or since no stores are accepting it yet, it sucks. And we're all seeing, those of us who are engaged on social media, one by one, new small business owners and some big business owners are starting to accept Bitcoin because they realize, like the rest of us have, that this is the next form of money. I really want to start accumulating this thing. And so they just take the hour required to build a channel where they can like accept that as money, super easy, and they can just start building that. And that's going to just happen at the ground floor and work all the way up, as we're seeing. So it's definitely no reason to stop. If any reason, if anything, it's more of a reason to really push hard, especially if you are an entrepreneur or a small business owner who wants to really get a leg up. You can make your balance sheet Bitcoin friendly and just start building that savings when hardly any other businesses out there are doing it. So you even get to go on social media and say, hey, I'm the first underwater basket weaver that accepts Bitcoin. And people will say, like, oh, that's super cool. And you'll get a bunch of free followers for it because, people, and a lot of Bitcoiners are also looking for people who are within the Bitcoin ecosystem to spend their sats. Like, Example, Ben Justman, the winemaker. He's like the Bitcoin wine guy. He's made a whole brand around this, and everyone buys their wine from him because they think it's so cool. He accepts Bitcoin, but that won't last forever. So anyone thinking about it, you gotta get on that.
Yeah, and one comment I would make is it's not without precedent to have a society which uses one kind of money for exchange and another kind of money for savings. And then a good example of this is Argentina, where people exchange with the peso and they save in dollars because you don't want to save in pesos even though it's the currency of that country because they lose value so quickly. And I think this is the example that we're going to see with Bitcoin over time, is that people will say, I can go to the grocery store and I can buy stuff with dollars, but I want to keep my savings in Bitcoin. And their savings, their unit of account for savings will be Bitcoin. And then, as they need to spend, they'll have a credit card. They'll go, rack up a monthly debit, and then they'll pay it off at the end of the month by selling a small fraction of their savings that were in Bitcoin. I think that's going to be the part of the transition that gets Bitcoin to being a global unit of account.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was definitely a step for me too, just realizing that there's the max supply is 21 million coins ever. That's never going to change. And when you have a piece of that, it remains a fixed percentage of that total supply forever. So this is a digital real estate, and you don't want to get rid of that unless you have a darn good reason to. And it's also amazing for savings because, like you said, this scarcity component is going to become more and more valued by people and coveted as more and more people get educated and realize that the money printers are just debasing their fiat funny money away, whether you're holding dollars or pesos or euros or whatever. Those are
Yeah,
all trending towards zero.
yeah. Once you really understand that Bitcoin is the only asset that gives you ultimate scarcity, it becomes irresistible as the vehicle in which you keep your savings.
Absolutely. Cool. Next question here. And this is one that we tend to hear on the airwaves every once in a while, the mainstream media. We hear a politician come on TV and say, this is money for criminals. There's so many criminals using Bitcoin, so clearly it's bad. What are your thoughts there?
I mean, there are two ways I think about this. Firstly, the fact that criminals want to use it gives you a sense that it is a really good form of money because they want to use it. Um, but at the same time, I think it's a little bit unfair because the fraction of usage of Bitcoin that is used by criminals is actually really quite small. The total magnitude of crime that's committed for money is US dollars by several orders of magnitude. There was a time in Bitcoin's early history when it was used as a currency for this illicit drug market, Silk Road. Um, but what I would say about that is that the people who used that service and who ran that service, they quickly realized that Bitcoin is not actually ideal as a currency for illicit activities because transactions, although they're not do not necessarily contain personal information, they remain on the blockchain forever, and this allows forensic analysis to be done many years later to help catch people who are using it for illicit purposes, and this is actually how a number of criminals have been caught. They dropped some digital breadcrumbs that they didn't even realize, and then years later they were caught by the FBI, for instance. So I don't think Bitcoin is really an ideal currency for criminal activity.
Yeah, and it sort of brings up that dichotomy between privacy and transparency. You can't really have both at the same time. And I know this is something that Bitcoiners, even the veterans, kind of argue about and talk about, like which is more important, because there are good things to be seen by both. Like the transparency of a new block every 10 minutes where every single node in the network can see every single transaction is pretty darn cool because it keeps like bad actors completely out of the way because it's impossible to get away with anything. Everyone would be able to see it. And if any funny business goes on, everyone knows, or enough people to cause a stir. And on the privacy side, it, all of your transactions will be there, and they're it doesn't show your name next to it. It's just going to be a string of digits. But so I'm curious, what do you think about that privacy versus transparency discussion? Which way is Bitcoin going? Which way do you think is best for it to go if you had to choose? And what do you think about that?
I think Bitcoin strikes a really good balance between privacy and transparency. And it's interesting. I think it's a really interesting question. I don't get this question very much, and I have, I think, a kind of controversial opinion on this. I think there are more dangers to um, uh, ultimate privacy than people recognize. And sometimes to try and understand an idea, I'll use a thought experiment and push something to the edge case and try and understand what the world would look like. And I try to think, what would the world look like if you could, even just for a few minutes a day, act in a completely private manner? Like you could go invisible and you could do anything you wanted while invisible for, say, an hour a day. Would the world be a better place or would it be a worse place? I actually think it would be much, much worse. It would be enormously worse. And the way I think about it is that most people are good. Most people do not want to harm others, but there is in the sort of distribution of social dispositions, there is a very small fraction of people who are very socially pathological. And the problem is, we now live in a world where individuals can do asymmetric damage. And I think that's very, very scary. It's actually one of the reasons I worry about the Fermi paradox, not to go down too deep a rabbit hole here, but I do worry about humanity when individuals can have asymmetric power and do asymmetric damage. And you get into a world where individuals can have enormous power, enormous power. Like, what would the world look like if every individual could assemble a nuclear weapon with household items? It would be a scary world, a very scary world. Not because most people are bad, but because there will be, one or two people who are bad who could cause so much damage that it would make civilization impossible. So I think there is, this is a long roundabout way of saying that I think there are some benefits to having transparency over privacy. I think it's important to have a balance here. And, it's great that Bitcoin by default doesn't show everyone's names and addresses and social security numbers and emails on the blockchain. It does take some work and probably like a court order to start digging into things. But it's also possible to dig into things if it's necessary.
And there are also plenty of methods out there for people who do want to go ultra private. Like coin joins are one of them. I know there's lots of methods people can use that I'm not super versed in myself. I haven't really dug into that, but I know that they're out there. So people can really use Bitcoin any way they want to in that sense. It definitely has some flexibility, and like so many other parts of it, it's just really intentionally made to where there's a good balance of trade offs, and it's just very helpful for folks. Um, Here's one that I know is quite common. People think that it's unevenly distributed to the rich. And this is one that we can sort of revisit one of our earlier points, our analogy of someone in the early days walking along the beach and picking up pieces of gold. And if I were to say, is it unfair that some people picked up gold before other people, so they had some more as soon as it got monetized? That seems like it would be a crazy thought, but that's pretty much exactly what people are saying about Bitcoin now. These people who found it really early and started accumulating it, they're now being viewed as like greedy and like, oh, it's just the new rich class, and it's unfair because they're going to have all the money, and Michael Saylor has so many Bitcoin, like it's unfair. What do you think about this conversation when people bring that up?
Well, I think people who think that way are taking a lot for granted. Firstly, Bitcoin has probably the fairest distribution mechanism that's ever been created. Satoshi published the white paper and made it public before he even started mining and said, there's going to be this network. Also, all the first coins that he mined are probably dead. Like they probably don't exist. Satoshi is gone. Whether he's dead or not, we don't know. But those coins have never moved and are very unlikely to move, given how valuable they are. It's very likely that they're never going to move. So the distribution mechanism he created was, I think, as fair as you could come up with. I would like anyone who doesn't like this to explain how you could have a fairer distribution mechanism. It's just I don't think it's possible to have a fairer distribution mechanism. And this idea that people who are early on got lucky, that I don't think most people realize how enormously difficult it was to be a believer in Bitcoin and to hold Bitcoin through these incredibly volatile cycles where it went up and then it dropped 90% and then it went up and then it dropped 80%. And I have heard, numerous stories about people who lost all their Bitcoin for various reasons because of carelessness, or they got freaked out when it crashed. The people who have held Bitcoin through all those years had something which everyone else didn't have. They had a combination of understanding and conviction. And that is deserving of a payoff. Those two things have always been in a capitalist system what you need to get enormously wealthy. Those are actually the twin pillars of wealth accumulation in any capitalist society, is that you have conviction, deep conviction, and you have patience, that you can wait. So people like Warren Buffett, who became really wealthy, that's really what they had. So I do not fault any person who's gotten wealthy because they had those two things. That is what you would summarize as market insight, the ability to see the future for what it is and invest in the present to take advantage of that.
And to not have that mechanism where people can take risks and put their money where their mouth is would be a huge problem, because that is what gets people to really look long term, while the speculators, and speculators again is not like a bad word, this is good, we want speculators who are taking these bets and predicting the future. So and that's a whole part of the free market investment in general, and just people choosing different forms of money that they want to hold for the long term. This is how we get to the best answer for everybody, is by people experimenting, taking these risks. So I love that point. I think that's fantastic. And also, just worth bringing up the fact that even those that do accumulate a bunch of this Bitcoin, they're never going to have power over the system, even if they have a huge percentage of the total supply. Bitcoin is different in the sense that it doesn't matter how much you have, you still can't change the rules, and that's the beauty of the proof of work protocol. So why don't we do a quick overview of what proof of work actually means and how it's different than this other type of mechanism called proof of stake? What do those both mean?
Okay, so proof of work is essentially a concept in computer science that you have expended a certain amount of energy to complete some task. And the benefit of proof of work is you can create a cost to doing something, and you can quickly take that cost and show it to someone else, and they can verify that, oh, you spent a lot of time doing this. Uh, it it's often described as like solving mathematical puzzles, but really it's kind of like a brute force task. And the way I would describe it is I drop a penny on a football field, and um, you have to find that penny. And I know for a fact that when you find that penny, on average, if I do this 100 times, you're going to spend a certain amount of work finding that penny, because you're going to have to spend a lot of time looking for it. That's what proof of work is. And if I want, I can make the task harder or easier by making the size of the field bigger or smaller. And this is one way that Bitcoin is able to um, uh, add protection to the transactions that are created. It's by getting the miners to put in a certain amount of work uh, and expend a certain amount of energy to attach to the transactions that they say are valid. And the way proof of work works with Bitcoin is that you have all these people in the network sort of building on this chain, and the chain that they choose to build on is the one which has the most work. So proof of work is a great system. It can tell the participants in a distributed system, like, we know that this amount of work has been done, and I want to follow the chain which has the most work, and that's how you get consensus in Bitcoin. That was the big breakthrough that Satoshi had, is to get a system where you have participants who don't trust each other, but they can come to consensus about financial transactions. Um, Proof of stake, on the other hand, you don't have any actual work being put in. People have to put their coins at risk. They have to stake their coins in a system like Ethereum, um, and uh, based on the amount of stake they have, they get to decide whether or not a transaction is valid or not. Um, I would say proof of stake is actually much more akin to the traditional banking system, where you have these stakeholders, people who are very powerful moneyed interests, who get a say in how the course of events happens, or in the world of blockchains, which transactions get to be verified. Um, I would say that Ethereum is much closer to the traditional banking system in this way, and Bitcoin is much closer to gold. Uh, with gold, when you see a gold coin, you know that a lot of work went into producing it, because you can look at the cost of mining. There was real energy expended, and that's part of what gives people confidence that gold is scarce. It is just very, very costly to produce new gold. And Bitcoin has that same property. You know that by the design of the Bitcoin protocol, when a new Bitcoin is produced, there was an enormous amount of energy and an enormous cost to produce that.
Yeah, and I just pulled up a tweet by Lynn Alden. It's one that I saved from actually almost 2 years ago now. And I think she put it extremely well. She said, "Proof of stake is legacy tech. It's what corporations and banks have run on for centuries. It's outdated and oligopolistic, and yet still useful for centralized systems. Proof of work is a new innovation, especially when combined with difficulty adjustments." And I think that it's a little bit longer than that. I'll put in the show notes for people to read like a thread, but essentially proof of stake is just like a centralized system makes the rules. Essentially, it's a complicated way of saying that. So when people bring up all these crypto altcoins that the marketing says it's faster or it uses less energy or it has all these things that trick the newbies, it doesn't mention that this is just like a rebranding of fiat. It's like a new form of fiat money, which is, I mean, what are we doing here if we're just trying to recreate the thing that's obviously causing problems? So, and it's also just wild to me how everyone, like practically everyone, myself included, falls for this trap early on and thinking that we're smarter than Bitcoin. We can find the next Bitcoin. Oh, Bitcoin is like the MySpace. They're going to make a better one. But the whole reason why Bitcoin is so special is because it has a proof of work behind it. It has no leader, no one in charge of it, and that is what's actually special here. That is the innovation, as Lynn Alden and you said. So, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's what makes Bitcoin truly unique, is that it uses this proof of work system, and then it has true decentralization. I think um it's a huge distinction between Bitcoin and all of these other altcoins, um, that that makes it a new thing in the world. And these other altcoins are really not a new thing. They're just kind of dressed up as a new thing when they're basically, like Lynn says, uh, kind of copying the legacy system.
Absolutely. So, let's jump into a real fun one that I still hear is the government is going to kill this thing. I mean, if it's really doing all these things that we say it's going to do, it's decentralized. There's no leader. There's no one in charge of it that has power over it. We know that the government likes to have control over things. They like to have power over everything, especially the money. Like the money is their biggest tool because they can print all these trillions of dollars for free and ship them all over to start wars all over the world and do whatever they want. And there's no responsibility there. Like it's the wet dream for every politician to just like print this stuff into oblivion. Clearly, they are not going to like this idea of a money that can't be controlled, can't be printed out of thin air, and actually follows these protocol rules. So, why is the government not just going to come in and say, Bitcoin, you're done, we're just going to take it away from you?
I'm perhaps uh, a little out of the norm in the Bitcoin community in thinking that this is still an open question whether the government is able to ban Bitcoin. Um, I sort of view it as a question of political capture. Will Bitcoin get to a certain size of adoption where it's just politically infeasible to ban it? Um, I do think the government has more power than some Bitcoin advocates would be willing to admit, and can destroy things. Governments are great at doing one thing, which is destroying things, destroying wealth, destroying societies, bombing places. That's what governments excel at. So I would not be too glib about this. I would say it's still a real risk, but I think we're transitioning now to a point of almost full political capture. I think that the approval of the ETFs and these major financial players in the Bitcoin space makes it much, much more difficult for the government to ban it. Um, I sort of view it a little bit like the adoption of Uber, the car sharing, ride sharing company, where they would go into cities and they would start their service, and a bunch of drivers would sign up and a bunch of customers would sign up. And the taxi lobby in a lot of cities around the world were very, very upset, and they would lobby their local city government to try and shut Uber down. And city governments moved fairly slowly, but when they got around to it, they're like, okay, we're going to regulate you, Uber. We're going to try and make it very difficult for you to compete with the taxi companies, or we're going to just try to outright ban you. But by the time they did this, Uber usually had become so popular and so ubiquitous in a city that it had a natural lobby of people who didn't want it to be killed, the drivers who were making money and the customers who really thought it was a superior service. I think the same thing is happening with Bitcoin, where enough people will have savings in Bitcoin that they'll be very, very upset if Bitcoin is shut down. And eventually it'll get to a place where shutting Bitcoin down would be kind of like shutting down the 401k program, which would just be politically impossible in the US. Too many people have their retirement in the 401k system that you just couldn't do something like this. And there are all sorts of signs that we're almost at that point where you have politicians who have savings in Bitcoin, politicians who advocate for Bitcoin, very powerful financial interests who are now on board with Bitcoin, like BlackRock and Fidelity. Um, I think we're going to have an answer to this question in the next few years, and perhaps as early as the next 1 or 2 years, where we could comfortably say, yeah, Bitcoin is not going to get shut down by the government. I would still be cautious, though, and say this is an open question, because if Bitcoin gets big enough, it starts to affect monetary policy. And I think the Federal Reserve and the banking system is going to recognize this, and if it gets too far out of their hands, they're going to be really, really worried and try and push back. This happened with gold in the 1970s, when gold looked like it was going to perhaps get monetized and the price was going through the roof. The Federal Reserve freaked out and raised interest rates just an enormous amount, from a low rate up to almost 20%. And that eventually killed the rally in gold. I think that moment is something like that is going to happen in the next couple of years, where the banking system and Federal Reserve comes to an understanding that if the world savings flees into Bitcoin, they lose control of monetary policy, because it doesn't help to be able to print money and to raise or lower interest rates when people's savings aren't in dollars. Control of monetary policy only works when people's savings are in dollar denominated assets.
Yeah, and there are a couple points that I tend to bring up to people who bring up this concern about the government crackdown. Um, the biggest one being China. I mean, I just Googled this to be sure because this number is constantly growing. I looked up how many times has China banned Bitcoin, and over the last 13 years, they've attempted to ban it 19 times, according to the first Google search. It's several. And how successful has that been? Not at all. All the miners inside China just moved to a different country. It's really easy to just move around. It's like the biggest, most impossible game of whack-a-mole trying to stop it. And then what is trying to realize, like, oh crap, like we're losing a bunch of money because all these people are making money elsewhere. And then they say, okay, fine, you can come back. And then like, oh, like but we really want our power though. And so they kick them out again. And it's just like, it's an impossible point at this period. And all these countries would have to work together in order to stop it, in order for the whack-a-mole game to really be won. And that, using that analogy, which I can never see happening. The countries are never going to work together that well. And even if they could, I just think it's too late because like you said, we have all of these, institutional buy-ins coming, and the ETFs and all these things. To me, the only thing that I really care about in terms of the ETFs, and this might be a controversial opinion, like I don't care about all the rich people get an easier path to Bitcoin. It's like really cementing it within, the zeitgeist of the moment, where it's impossible for these states to be able to try to stop it, because it would just create too much havoc. And the more big money that comes in, the more like whales we have on our side basically saying, don't touch this thing, and if you try, it's not going to work even if you wanted to.
Yeah, the ETFs are sort of a Trojan horse, a financial Trojan horse that brings Bitcoin into the financial system, and then, the libertarian stormtroopers flood out of the bottom of the horse and like take over the citadel. Um, I, I agree with all of what you're saying there. I would just say that the U.S. government, if it puts its mind to something, can cause a lot of damage. Uh, Bitcoin's decentralization makes it very anti-fragile, but if a state attack comes, it won't be against necessarily the network itself, which I think is very, very resilient. It'll be against the centralized players. And that is one point that's potentially dangerous about these ETFs, is that there's such a large concentration of ownership that is being held by a very small number of players. Most of these ETFs are custodying their Bitcoin with Coinbase. So Coinbase is like this very centralized point of attack if the US government ever wants to come at Bitcoin. What I think would really help before we get true decentralization of custody is that we get political capture. That's when I'll feel much more comfortable, and I think that's an open question for the next few years.
Yeah, and that's where the whole privacy side of things will come in too, where people have these methods to just use Bitcoin peer to peer, because that is the way that it was designed in the first place. Was that, I mean, these big exchanges are just like part of a temporary transition period. There won't always be exchanges, because at some point all the Bitcoin will be held, and there you won't go to like this centralized marketplace honeypot to buy your Bitcoin, but you'll need to provide goods and services to the economy in order to earn Bitcoin. That it'll just be a fully perforated money at that point. And I know that's probably a ways away. Like, exchanges aren't going away tomorrow, but that's sort of the way I look at it, is that they're sort of just there for the transition period. And I don't really care if they're, a big centralization risk. If they blow up, like cool, cheap Bitcoin is going to cause chaos in the market. I get some deals. Like, I mean, but there are ways that you can buy Bitcoin peer to peer right now. I mean, you can just find a friend personally, or you can go to a place like Hodl Hodl online. Like, there are ways to do that, but I mean, it's certainly worth looking at still, because I do think that these last pieces of centralization within the Bitcoin ecosystem are probably going to see some chaos in the coming years. Like, do you have any predictions for how things are going to unfold here in the rest of this decade and beyond?
I'm not sure exactly how it's going to play out over the next few years. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I do think there'll be a point at which Bitcoin's adoption becomes almost inevitable. I think in terms of a longer time horizon, I have a very high confidence that Bitcoin will become the world's reserve currency, because most nations want a neutral monetary base. They want the global reserve currency to be something that's not controlled by a particular country. And this goes back to Charles de Gaulle in the 60s, when he sort of pointed out the US had gotten an exorbitant privilege by having control over the monetary order when it crafted the Bretton Woods monetary agreement in the 1940s. Um, so I think there are properties that make Bitcoin really suitable as the global money. It's just a neutral form of money that isn't controlled by anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of looking way into the future, what about quantum computers, VJ? Aren't they just gonna, they're gonna be so fast, and they're just gonna be able to break the Bitcoin code, and they're gonna be able to hack everyone? Like, do you worry about that?
Not really, because I don't think this is a threat that's going to come out of nowhere. It's something that we'll know about many years advance, and Bitcoin can be adapted so that it becomes quantum safe. This isn't something that's particularly scary. I'm also quite skeptical of the development of quantum computers, that this is going to be something that's going to be ever achieve a scale, at least in my lifetime, that makes it scary for Bitcoin. We'll see, though. I could be wrong. I don't think that even if I'm wrong about it, that it's going to happen so quickly or so overnight that we can't adapt. And it's not just Bitcoin; it's just the entire internet security infrastructure would be at risk. Bitcoin, though, has had enough research on it regarding quantum risks that there are many solutions available to adapt Bitcoin to that risk if it comes to pass.
Yeah, and also that's where the transparency side comes in as well. If something started trying to brute force the network, people would be able to see that, and changes can be made to the Bitcoin network. Like it's not impossible. It's extremely difficult. You need to get through like a hellstorm of, the what's the word I'm looking for? It's just a really difficult process because you need consensus from so many different sides. But if something like that were to come up and it was very clear among all the network participants that we needed to fix this thing and adjust it to be able to withstand those sorts of attacks, it could be done. And that's what would happen theoretically. Like we haven't seen anything like that happen, but I don't really stress about it because I know that Bitcoin's in good hands. The developers are really on point, and it's so decentralized that it's going to be like it'll be interesting to see if something like that does happen. Honestly, I'd be looking forward to it because it'll be entertaining to watch unfold. Because this is one of the ways that we get to watch these FUD points just kind of pick off one by one is because every time they happen, Bitcoin just becomes stronger. It's like the 32 headed hydra. Every time you throw something at it, it just comes out the other side stronger. Another use case comes up, like wow, it can withstand that too. That's crazy, and the price just goes up. More people buy in.
Yeah, I sort of view this quantum risk as similar to, an asteroid hitting the Earth risk. Like, it is a risk that an asteroid might hit the Earth and have a devastating impact on civilization, but we don't kind of walk around living our lives, under the worry that that's going to happen tomorrow. If we do detect an asteroid out in outer space that's on a crash course for Earth, obviously we'd put a lot of effort into finding a solution to that. But to me, it's a long tail risk. It's not like something that's a near term exigent risk that we need to worry about right now.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of in line with another common one, which is what if the internet goes down? Smart Bitcoiner. I mean, come on. If the entire internet goes down, first of all, theoretically, Bitcoin can be used with smoke signals or like writing on a paper. Like people have done videos of them like basically playing out the algorithm with a piece of paper and pen. Now, it's obviously extremely inefficient versus a computer that does this, but people will find a way if they really believe in that technology. And if any crazy scenario like that ever happens, then who knows? We'll have to see how it goes. It's one of those risks. It's like it's so small. Like, why are we even worrying about this? What are we talking about? Like, I feel like at some point the people that just really want Bitcoin to not work enough will do so many mental gymnastics to try to convince themselves that surely something is going to be able to stop this thing because they're just salty that they didn't buy it earlier and they didn't get any when they first heard it the first time and they haven't been able to forgive themselves. And I think
I'm salty too, my friend. I am salty that I heard about Bitcoin in I think maybe it was even 2010. I didn't even pay attention to it. It was only when my friend introduced me to it and said you should take this that everyone feels bad that they didn't get into Bitcoin earlier. So anyone who thinks that way should not feel bad because everyone feels that way, and we're so early in the adoption curve. It's like people in 1996 or 1997 arguing about how they were really late because they saw someone using Mosaic a few years earlier, and so the internet wasn't going to be big. I do not worry about this. This is one of the big themes that people come up with is that, oh, we're really late, the price seems so high. Don't worry about that. That the price seems high to everyone when they buy Bitcoin, whether it was $10, $100, 1,000, or 100,000 soon enough.
yeah, and that's why one of the things I really try to encourage people to do is just zoom out and look at the long term here in terms of money through time. And your article, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, and which is now a book, does such a great job laying that out for people, just seeing how money has transitioned through different time periods. So I highly recommend that to everybody. And I also pulled up a clip here before we started. I'm sure you've heard of American Hodl. He had a great clip on
He's a good
Walker's
friend of mine.
podcast. Oh yeah, he's the best. And I really want to fit this in because I think it is perfect for what we're talking about. So give me just one moment. Let me pull this up.
I hope it's his chart video.
This is a brand new one. It came out just a few days ago.
Okay.
We're talking about ancestry. Like, think of the long.
Oh, whoops! I have my super high speed on. Let me turn that back to normal people speed.
We are a one-off in terms. We're talking about ancestry. Like, think of the blockchain of humanity that you exist at. Well, by luck or by happenstance or by divine providence, like you are at the cornerstone of the changing of money from analog to digital. That's a big fucking deal. It's a big deal because really fiat to me is a blip. It's nothing. It's an error code. Like fiat is it's running on the fumes of the gold standard. Really, humanity has two monies. It has gold for 5,000 years, and then it has Bitcoin, digital gold, for the next 5,000 years. And by sheer dumb luck or by, you know what I mean, divinity, we happen to be at the precipice of this changeover, and nobody knows that it's happening except for the people that are here. And the number one question that every millennial's grandchildren are going to ask them is, why didn't you buy Bitcoin? What were you doing? How did you not see this? But of course they won't be able to see it because it's only the crazy people like us who can see it, you know, for now. Eventually, maybe like after this bull run gets going and it's $1 million a coin and MicroStrategy is one of the most profitable companies in the world and blah, 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 blah. It becomes really hard to ignore it at that point. Like, I think I just read on Twitter at $200,000 of Bitcoin, Bitcoin is more profitable than every company in the S&P 500. Like Bitcoin has a higher market cap than every company in the S&P 500. So Bitcoin outweighs Apple Computer, Saudi Aramco, Exxon, Coca-Cola, etc. You can't ignore that. It's impossible.
So I love that because especially the part where he labels fiat as this annoying little error code in between the two forms of money, gold to Bitcoin, because I think that's absolutely correct. I think that we're in this awkward little limbo phase where, you know, humans made these governments, they figured out how to capture it basically and convince the world that they should buy pieces of paper instead. And we figured it out now. We're about to get out of that. And anyone who's not getting this is just missing the bigger picture. So I know that we're getting a little close to the end of our time here. So why don't we wrap this up with just your take on that? And anyone who's read your writing knows that you do a lot of thinking about this long term perspective of how money changes through history from seashells to gold and now Bitcoin. So what is your take on just this big picture, what you're seeing, what you're thinking about, and what people should be thinking when they hear someone say, like, get off zero? What do you think there?
I just want to comment on that clip by American Hollow. If anyone is, their conviction is faltering, they should watch a video by him. He's incredible. I also want to point out that I think it's a little counterintuitive. People's conviction gets tested a lot more in a bull market than in a bear market. I just thought that was so interesting. I posted a link in the chat, a link on Twitter. This is something I've said as well. I view the period between the the gold standard and the Bitcoin standard, I call that the fiat money interregnum. It's this brief period of history, which is just a huge anomaly. This is not how money has worked throughout history. Humans have always desired money that's hard to produce. So we are living in a historical anomaly, and I think it'll end. I completely agree with Hoddle on that one. Where we are, I would say that we are transitioning from Bitcoin being a kind of curiosity amongst a fairly small, limited group of people, cypherpunks, computer scientists, libertarians, Silicon Valley types, intrepid investors, to it becoming a store of value that's used by a large fraction of the world's population. And that transition is going to take Bitcoin to the stage where it's viewed as a direct competitor to gold. It will be viewed, I think, as the preeminent non-sovereign store of value. That is a store of value that's not controlled by governments. Once it gets to that stage, I think the last leap will be to go from the global preeminent non-sovereign store of value to becoming the world's reserve currency. That's going to take Bitcoin from somewhere around $1 million per Bitcoin to somewhere 10 million plus, where all the global savings will be denominated in Bitcoin. So I see us as sort of moving in sort of the second stage. The four stages are: first stage is it's just a curiosity and people think it's going to go away. It's a tulip mania. The second stage is it's like money for internet nerds. The third stage is it becomes digital gold, and the fourth stage is the reserve currency of the world. I think we're transitioning from stage 2 to stage 3, and I think that's going to happen at this cycle and perhaps the next cycle. And then the transition from becoming, the global store of value to the reserve currency, that's going to take another couple of decades.
Excellent, man. Well, Vijay Boyapati, author of the Bullish Case for Bitcoin article and book of the same name. I'm going to put those in the show notes because everyone needs to read them. There's also an audiobook, or not audiobook, a podcast version done by Guy Swan on Bitcoin Audible. That's what I listened to when I was sort of getting ready to chat with you. Everyone needs to check those out. They're fantastic. And thank you again so much for coming, man. I think we covered some good stuff here, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Ben. I just one extra thing I would say: the book itself is actually on Audible. If you want
Okay,
to
awesome.
listen
There is
to
an
the book.
audiobook. Cool.
Guy Swan's excellent reading is of the original article, but the Audible version is of the book, which is quite a bit longer and has extra content.
Excellent. Very cool. Well, I guess people can just first read the article to get a preview and then just go straight into the book. That's how I did it. And the book is now sitting on a shelf at home. I'm still waiting to try to get my parents to read it. So it's a great one to share with folks as well because it's very entry level. It talks in big, sweeping, general terms of helping people understand why this is so important and impactful for people, not just like a number going up and down on a screen, which so many people can get sucked into. So yeah, man. Thanks you so much for coming by, and we'll definitely be in touch, sir.
Thanks, Ben.